Guys, I'm really thrilled to welcome to the podcast my friend Scott Walter. In fact, you might have seen him in 2000 Mules. Scott is the president of the Capital Research Center in Washington, D.C. He was a domestic policy special assistant to the president in the George W. Bush administration. And the website for Capital Research Center is capital, C-A-P-I-T-A-L, capitalresearch.org. Scott, welcome. Great to have you. Always fun to talk. And whenever I see you, my mind kind of flashes back to our old days at the American Enterprise Institute. And also we collaborated, as you know, on the magazine called Crisis. And this was really the era of the Cold War and then the aftermath of the Cold War. And there was a clear distinction, wasn't there, between the free world and the unfree world. In fact, we almost automatically thought of ourselves, we're part of the free world. But on the other hand, you have the Soviet Union, you have Cuba. At that time, we'd talk about Nicaragua. So there was this bright line. Would you agree that this bright line has now, at least to a degree, dissolved, and some of the forms of unfreedom that we would point to in other countries can now be found right here in the United States?
Yes, it's a very sad thing that largely because we're not teaching our own people about the nature of freedom and constitutional government, they are easily susceptible to the winds of other things. Plus, conservatives always knew that power corrupts, right? The great Catholic Lord Acton, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely.
So you think, Scott, that these days when somebody says to an American or to a young person, hey, listen, we need to have this regime of censorship because guess what? There's just a lot of misinformation on the internet. Misinformation, of course, defined here as information that we in the Biden regime don't like. They even have come up with the phrase malinformation, and malinformation is information that's true, but nevertheless leads to a conclusion that they don't want. So, for example, if you say something like, vaccines don't prevent you from getting COVID and they don't prevent you from transmitting COVID to others. Those are true statements, but they could be classified as malinformation because they may produce, quote, vaccine hesitancy. And since the government wants you to be willing to take the next booster, the next shot, they classify this as worthy of censorship. I mean, I think if we flash back 20 years, even if somebody was left of center, they would look at this like, this, you gotta be joking. This is nuts. Because there was a general consensus, wasn't there, that our basic liberties of free speech, equal rights under the law, these were inviolable and not even democratic majorities had the right to override them.
Yes. And of course, the left would wrap itself in free speech, the mantle of free speech. The free speech movement, quote unquote, begins in Berkeley with left-wing students.
No, that's absolutely right. All right, let's talk about tyranny today, because when people look around the world, and a classic example here would be China. China, I think it's probably fair to say, is the largest totalitarian regime in the world. And I use the term totalitarianism in the sense that Jeane Kirkpatrick did. A totalitarian as compared to, say, an authoritarian regime. An authoritarian regime would be like Franco. Is one guy, he's running the country, he doesn't like opposition, but he doesn't care how you live your life. But the Chinese do care. They care how you live your life, and they want to manage your life through the centrally directed instruments of the state. So do you think that China is the greatest expression today of tyranny in the 21st century?
It's easily the most powerful tyranny, and almost certainly the most dangerous as well. I mean, North Korea is obviously a worse place to live in, but nobody's worried that North Korea is going to take over, the electronics sector.
Yeah, no, I mean, the thing about China is that you're talking about, first of all, you've just got over 1 billion people under its sway. So right there, you've got like 12 or 13% of the planet under tyrannical control. Then you have China's massive influence over the region and extending influence. Talk a little bit about the ways in which the Chinese are trying to extend their influence in the United States?
Sure. It's, I would say there's sort of two paths that they're looking at. One is the simpler to understand, which is just they want to steal our intellectual property, right? So they're infiltrating labs, whether it's at big corporations or at universities, just to steal stuff because, that's useful and you can make money off that and the rest. And it's shocking how much of that there is. Every year there's more people discovered doing this, usually just for monetary reasons, not political philosophy reasons. But the other one is the infiltration of things like, first of all, controlling all Chinese citizens, all Chinese people around the world, just as they're slowly smothering Hong Kong, which had been under British protection. Similarly, we now discover that in places like Manhattan, there are secret Chinese police departments in Manhattan. There's one in Manhattan to keep an eye on and deal with any Chinese folks who may not be doing what the regime wants.
When we come back, Scott, let's pursue this because I want you to also address, aren't the Chinese also putting a lot of money into education centers and setting up Chinese almost infiltrations in key American universities, research centers, and so on? When we come back, more with Scott Walter, president of Capital Research Center, the website capitalresearch.org. Back with my friend Scott Walter, president of Capital Research Center. We're talking about China and tyranny in the 21st century. Scott, it seems like the Chinese are pulling out all the stops, and it also seems like there is a kind of vulnerability that they recognize on the part of the Biden administration. In other words, that the Biden administration is not going to take the same kind of tough stance that Trump attempted to take against China, and so they can get away with it.
Yes, we spoke about things like the Chinese having a secret police department in Manhattan to watch over Chinese people to make sure they're not doing anything that the regime considers harmful. But another way, which is much broader, I believe, and more insidious and dangerous, they started dozens and dozens of Confucius Institutes, they were called, on college campuses. Now, some of those have been thrown out. Some of those have just been renamed because that's a classic way. If you're caught, you just sort of rebrand. But, some of the motivation to be on college campuses is, again, stealing intellectual property from college labs. But there's also the deeper thing of that is spreading the notion that the Chinese way of life is really better. And by the way, let's not forget our friends at the New York Times. Thomas Friedman and others, Andy Stern, one of the biggest labor leaders in America, people like that for years now have been saying, China is really sort of better than us in some ways because, when the regime decides it wants something, it can make that happen. And it's, we have this messy process, and it doesn't always work so easily for us to work our will on the American people the way the Chinese government can work its will on its people.
I mean, Scott, there's an interview, I think this goes back to 2013. Obama was interviewed by the New York Times, and at the very end of the article, a very telling passage where Obama says that. He goes, listen, I kind of envy the Chinese because they just say the word and it gets done. I think what Obama was saying is, gee, here it's much more difficult. I need to get Congress and, there are all kinds of systems of block and tackle that make it difficult for us to get things done in the United States, obviously by the constitutional design implanted by the founders. Now, a lot of people looking at China are a little puzzled because it appears to be a kind of weird hybrid. On the one hand, it clearly is communism of a sort. You still have the centralized authority. That hasn't gone away. It's very different in this respect than Russia, where the old Soviet system, whatever you call what's going on in Russia, it's not the old Soviet system anymore. But in China, you've got that communist hierarchy. At the same time, you seem to have at least a quasi-free market system that's delivering unprecedented, undeniable economic growth. What do you think is a way we can wrap our heads around understanding what the Chinese are all about?
Well, I think our old friend from AEI, Michael Ledeen, is the most penetrating view of this whole issue. He makes the argument that it would seem that the China of today ought to be understood as a mature fascist state more than a communist state. And I'll give you a couple of there are 2 or 3 reasons for this. In the classic communism of Mao or Lenin and Stalin, for one thing, it was international, right? Now, the fascists and the Nazis, on the other hand, had a national focus, right? So for Lenin, the Communist Party is going to take over the world and nations will dissolve. For Hitler, the German nation will take over the world, right? So that now they're both totalitarian and horrific, but that is a significant difference. And what do you see in China today? Now the Chinese leaders don't talk like Lenin with the Communist Party taking the world over. Instead, they hearken back to Confucius, as we just even mentioned. So they want the ancient Confucius ethic of hard work and honesty. And they also talk about the greatness of China's history, and they work on resentments, right? I mean, obviously Hitler worked on resentments that the German nation wasn't getting respect, and then now the Chinese tyrants work on the great Chinese nation isn't getting respect, because you want resentment in your populace to help support the government. There's another thing too that's obvious, and you sort of already begun to raise it, and that is, under classic communism of Mao or Stalin, well, the party is going to run businesses. We don't really need anything like markets or a normal economy the way the West would think of it. But under fascism, Nazism, well, you have companies like Krupp's, some of the biggest companies around collude with the regime. Now, it's not true free markets. It's not what Milton Friedman would want, but it's not exactly the same as the centrally planned Communist Party running everything. So you very much have that in communism today. The other thing that Ledeen made a point of that's really scary, he was scared by it and I'm scared by it, that is that, we tend to think that all these totalitarian regimes are completely unstable and are going to collapse because they did collapse, thank God, in the 20th century, mostly. Now, the problem is that they seem to actually have been pretty popular at the time. Mussolini, Hitler, they had to be defeated by force of arms. They did not collapse because their own people said, hey, we don't want this tyranny anymore. And especially the young found them appealing. Now, Ledeen fears that, in fact, the existing regime in China may be relatively popular with its people. Obviously, there are dissidents, but it's not clear how big a proportion they are. And certainly it's not clear that there's enough of them with enough strength to bring down the tyranny, which is a very scary thought.
Let's take a pause. When we come back, more with Scott Walter, president of Capital Research Center. Scott Walter, president of Capital Research Center, the website capitalresearch.org. Scott, you discussing the work of our colleague Mike Ledeen, and it's important to note that Mike Ledeen wasn't just sort of sitting around at AEI. This is a guy who spent much of his adult life studying fascism. If I'm not mistaken, he was one of the leading experts on Italian fascism and the Italian fascist theoreticians Giovanni Gentile and others. Now, Ledeen seems to be making a very subtle and in a way very interesting point, and that is that fascism in a weird way has never fully been tried. That's why he's using the phrase mature fascism, because let's think about it. Hitler came to power in 1933, but he started a war in 1939. So 6 years later, basically, he puts the fate of fascism on the battlefield. This can be contrasted, let's say, with the Bolsheviks, who came to power right around 1919 or 1920. They had a chance for almost 60 years to try out their system and show that it doesn't really work. So Ledeen seems to be saying that mature fascism is a fascism that really has a chance to prove itself, and the Chinese may be producing. If it seems like different than what Mussolini did or Hitler did, that's because it is fascism in a much more advanced or mature state. Isn't that what Ledeen is saying?
Yes, and of course we want to reiterate that he considers it horrific tyranny and a terrible threat, but things that are terrible are sometimes successful, at least for extended periods of time. And you're exactly right. One of the differences that he makes is, through Mao was the leader of China for many years, he was in the classic communist mode of this is an international movement and the party is just going to run everything and we don't need businesses at all. But then that, of course, did not work because socialism always fails. And so by the time you have Mao's successor, Premier Deng, you have him sort of tacitly admitting, well, things haven't gone as wonderfully as we'd hoped. And so we're going to have to make some adjustments, and we're going to have some room for business and the rest. And part of that, of course, was also we want Western businesses that are rich and flourishing to come in and invest and help us grow economically so that our people won't overthrow us, because starving people will overthrow eventually.
Now, when we talk about ways in which the Chinese today are controlling their population, you notice that some of those ways, not all, are beginning to make their presence felt in the United States. And so you have for example, you talked about how fascism is a combination between the state and the private sector, the state and business. Well, let's look at censorship in America. Is it not a collaboration between the state, the Biden administration, and I wouldn't just say digital platforms, but as you know, nonprofits, academia is involved. And so there is a certain, you could almost call it fascist strain that's here also, maybe not as developed as there is in China. You told me a very interesting anecdote, I guess it is, about how some years ago, the late Alan Bloom and his colleague Walter Burns at Cornell tried out an experiment with the students. Talk about that experiment, because I think it's revealing of how even in this country we've developed a mindset that can see nascent fascism and not really recognize it.
Sure. Bloom and his colleague, our old AEI colleague, Walter Burns, are at Cornell as the 60s radicals are there and protesting and the rest. And Bloom, in his Closing of the American Mind book, talks about how a professor, and I'm betting it was Walter Burns, wanted to try to teach these radicals something about what they really were. So he said, let me read you this speech about what must be done. Right. And he read paragraph after paragraph to the students, and they loved it and they reacted with passion. And it was exactly the same kind of rhetoric that they and their leaders around the country were spouting. And then the professor said, congratulations, you've just applauded Mussolini. Those are his speeches. Now, that shows you the intertwining of this. And there's another great, powerful thing like that. The British eccentric Patrick Fermor was tramping across Europe in the 30s. He's in Germany, a young man. He's poor. He didn't have any place to sleep. The young man says, oh, you can crash at my place. And he gets to the guy's place. And in the attic, he sees the guy's brown shirt uniform. He was in the street thugs of the Nazis. He has Hitler posters, Nazi artifacts everywhere. And, Fermor's a little shocked by this. And what does the young man say? He said, you should have been here a year ago. It was all Lenin. Right? The same kid had been a communist gung-ho guy, I'm sure, in street gangs in Germany, fighting on the communist side. And we have to understand that these are just different flavors of a religion of total politics. That's what totalitarianism is.
Very insightful stuff, Scott. And wow, what an interesting anecdote. Thanks for joining me. We'll have you back. Scott Walter, president of Capital Research Center, the website capitalresearch.org.